Hey Obsidians, my name is Gray, and I'm here today to talk to you about AAVE. If you don't know what that acronym stands for, it means African American Vernacular English, also known as Black English or formerly known as Ebonics. So, one question I get a lot in my life is why can't Black people speak proper English? And the simple fact is that we don't acknowledge that Black English is a dialect of English, and it can be easily traced all the way back down to slavery. Part of the reason why we do not speak the same version of English in general as white Americans do is directly correlated to slavery and the fact that we weren't allowed to read books and things like that. So, a couple months back, I ran into this book that I really found deeply inspiring and also deeply knowledgeable, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how I wanted to be able to work with it. And generally a lot of things on Obsidian are written form thus far, and I'm starting to move towards playing with other formats, and it's partly because of this book. So this book doesn't make sense to be written. If I just write out some of the phrases that come up, you won't actually be able to hear it or understand why it exists that way. And so, we're going to be exploring this book. Talkin and Testifyin. It's a book I happened across several months ago. I believe through my Amazon suggested purchases, but I found it to be deeply fascinating and like 2 pages in, and I've been holding on to it for the right time. One of the many cool things about Black English is that it is much more succinct than white American English is. In white American English, you use more words to describe what you're trying to talk about. In Black English, you want your sentences to be much shorter and to the point. Reading in other languages, and in some languages, they mix words that they consider to be not important to understand the meaning of the sentence. And this is essentially what Black English does. But because it's in English, and because Black people have the unfortunate reputation of being uneducated, people assume that it's done out of ignorance and not out of an actual vocabulary choice. So 2 of the languages that you can find that still use some of the structure I'm going to talk about in a minute is Pidgin and Creole, which I find really fascinating. Those are some of the oldest dialects in the United States, and the structure is still really clear there. One of the things that comes up in the very first chapter of this book, which is the only part I'm going to focus on today, is the fact that when Africans were brought to this country and started to learn English, they would do a thing that is incredibly common when people are learning a second language. They take the structure they know over here and they insert the words they're learning into that structure. That way, you can still be understood and it still makes sense to you. This is essentially a lot of the basic reasoning for how Black English ended up developing. Because people were not formally trained in the language they were learning, they had no school books, were not able to read, all they had for their ability to learn the language was through spoken word. And so what people would do is they would take the structure of the language they had already learned in their lives and they would simply insert other words into it. What ends up happening is it ends up being a much sharper, shorter language that has some different rules in it than the standard white American English does. Which means they're totally different. Yes, they use the same words, but they use them differently, and they use a lot of things in it differently to describe possibly the same things. So for this next section, I'm going to read through some of the structural grammar rules that come up in this book that I thought was really interesting, and I'm reading it in the tone that makes the most sense. So, in this section on page 6, which is super early in this book, it's highlighted for me under Grammar and Structure Rules of West African Languages. This section of the book on page 6, there is a portion for Grammar and Structure Rules in West African Language. Repetition of the noun subject with pronoun. For instance, in Black English, that would be, my father, he worked there. The second rule is question patterns without do. What it come to? Meaning, what does it come to? Third is same form of noun for singular and plural. We no longer do this generally, I feel, in Black English, but the example in the book is having one boy and having 5 boys. And later in the book it describes that as being a misunderstanding between the English language of if the rule is that 1 boy equals this thing, why can't it be 5 boys equal this thing? It's no longer used as much, which I also talk about in this book, and I'll get to that in a moment. No tense indicated in verb. Emphasis on manner or character of action. I know it good when he asked me. The next one, same verb form for all subjects. I know, you know, he knows, he know, we know, they know. This comes back to that misunderstanding of the English structure. They also have sound rules, which I've talked about in one of my very first articles on Obsidian about the way that you pronounce names in Black English versus White English. Yes, it matters. That's the whole reason why the Key and Peele sketch is actually funny. Our pronunciations of certain vowels and sounds are different, and here are some examples. There are no consonant pairs. Just instead of just. Men instead of mend. There are also few long vowels or two-part words or two-part vowels, also known as diphthongs. So in this example, it's rat for right, or time for time. There's often no R sound. I want some mo versus I want some more. And there is no TH sound. Self and this. That one personally for me always gets me because my family has made fun of me for as long as I can remember for having picked up this old way of speaking where I don't always pronounce TH sounds. It always comes off in a different sound. So you can understand me, but is it proper? No. Just like any language and or dialect, as you're growing up in your family, you often pick up the way that they speak or the language that they speak. So most Black people in America can speak in this dialect. It's natural, it's what your family does. One thing they mention in this book, which is actually from the 80s, and so some of these things no longer happen, is that as time goes on, our linguistics get farther away from this dialect. We become more and more assimilated into the dominant culture, and we lose some of these different ways of speaking. So for me, I never say 1 boy, 5 boy. I always say 1 boy, 5 boys. It was actually kind of difficult for me to do during this video. But there are some things that are still carried over. There is a sense of pushing and pulling within majority of Black people for a variety of different subjects, and one of the biggest ones is on language. What do I mean by that? Well, your cultural lineage is passed through language in some ways. We are an oral culture, and so being able to speak within a dialect is considered important. And not being able to speak within the dialect is considered talking white. Now people hear this all the time, and there's a great deal of discourse in the Black community about this phrase, What does it mean to talk white? Why is talking proper talking white? Etc, etc, etc. And so what ends up happening is there's a sense of a push and pull. You want to, when you're with your black friends or family, there's also a desire to not have to pick, to be able to do whichever one is more comfortable for you personally. And unfortunately at this time, that is not generally accepted by either side, which makes it quite difficult to progress in white culture. You have to learn how to speak the same way they do. And on the other hand, to be accepted into the black culture, you need to make sure that people don't think you've lost what it means to be black, and don't think you've scorned your heritage by becoming white. So although it's kind of a filler for a lot of these feelings, a lot of people either, like I said, learn both or intentionally refuse to learn how to talk white, because there is actually nothing wrong with Black English, and it has its own structural and grammatical rules in how to speak it. This is why I'm super passionate about the subject, is because it's actually affecting real people's lives. If I were to use this dialect in my daily life, I feel like this project of Obsidian wouldn't be as received as well. Additionally, I couldn't be respected as an instructor, and I would have a lot of trouble doing a lot of things in white society. Even just going to the bank or seeing a doctor would be more difficult, because then they would take certain ideas about me which would make my life harder later down the road, because of their assumptions and their biases. Unfortunately, it means that I spend most of my time not talking in the dialect that I grew up in. It's only when I'm with other Black people, and there does have to be a certain critical mass, that I feel comfortable and able to speak in that dialect. And even then, I tend to be on a bit of the formal side. So there are a lot of feelings that come into this bit about language, which is why I find it so deeply personal for me to make this video. So the cool thing is that this is just chapter 1 of this book, and I'm already highlighting tons and tons of lines in the next chapter. And so if you want to get this book and be able to read and then watch these videos, I highly suggest it. I'm going to put a link in the description of the video, and please consider supporting us on Patreon. It's a service where you can become a member and you get access to videos like this, articles we've written, and so much more, often exclusively or just before everyone else. And your support in that is what definitely helps this project continue. Without that support and without this community that's been created on Patreon, there's no way we'd be able to continue this project. So if you like what you're seeing, consider supporting us on Patreon. There will also be a couple other things in the description about different ways you can support if that's not your thing. If you like to do a one-time support, there'll be a link for coffee.com. And if not that, there will be a PayPal and, of course, our Amazon wish list. So you buy something on there, you help us keep going with what we wanted to do anyway. And after this, we're just going to have a list of our supporters. And thank you so much. Have a good night. Peace.